Good evening, everybody from Istanbul. Good afternoon to people in Boston and in the other side of the ocean. My name is Ömer Aygün. I am a philosophy professor at Galatasaray University in Istanbul, and I'm very honored to be presenting today. I would like to thank the philosophy department at Boston College and John Bagby, who made this possible. I'm very excited and very honored, as I said, but do feel free to interrupt me with questions, ask for clarifications. I'm open to that kind of thing. So, I'm wondering whether I could. So now you see the presentation mode. If I'm not, yeah, but then I won't be able to read. Okay. So, well, we all know the story, the cave story at the opening of Book 7 of Plato's Republic. Here I propose that we awaken the story. We unsettle it and we set it up and we reanimate it. I am very honored and grateful to the philosophy department at Boston College for giving me the great opportunity to talk at this exciting new series, Phenomenological Readings of Ancient Greek Philosophy, and to our newly defended Dr. John Bagby for making this meeting possible. I intend to use this opportunity given to me to pay my tribute the best I can to Dr. John Salis, who initiated me and many of my peers into rereading ancient Greek texts. This I intend to do by taking up a move in his reading of the cave story in Being and Logos, namely his thoughtful and careful, quote unquote, focus on the opening scene of the story and the mindset of the cave dwellers. This thread I shall elaborate in this talk, that is the cave dwellers' everyday life, their conversations, their concerns, and their contests. And I'll try to make the following claims, 3 claims. The first is, the opening scene of the story is not insignificant at all, quickly to be dismissed. It is rather most important because it lets us understand the prisoner not as a solipsistic, disinterested, theoretical spectator, reminiscent of a brain in a vat, but a social, practical, bodily, desiring being with a past and an agenda of her own. Secondly, her education demands agency and initiative on her part, so she's not passively exposed to more and more sophisticated objects. She's not simply dragged around like a puppet, basically, or it's not enough that she gets her body acclimatized physiologically, or it's not a matter of an external source of spiritual enlightenment that she's supposed to be undergoing. Finally, the last claim that I'll try to substantiate is that the function of the sun in the story as a source of light is not sufficient or adequate for making sense of the story. We need to underline and take into account another aspect of the sun in order to make sense of the story. I'll leave that little aspect to the end as a little surprise, perhaps. But before I begin my reading, I would like my talk to my reading to follow from 2 methodological restrictions, and I want to keep the methodological restrictions very minimalistic. And the challenge that I'm setting for myself is to follow 2 methodological restrictions and come up with a relatively rich and interesting interpretation of the story. Both of these restrictions are, again, inspired by Salis's work. The first one I shall call the Philological Constraint. This constraint is meant to put us on guard against typical approaches that quickly and exclusively focus on correctly counting the stages of the cave story, or the kinds of objects in the story, whether there are 3 or 4 or 5, and comparing that number with other numbers, the 4 segments of the divided line, the 2 realms of Platonic dualism, or the 5 mathematical studies, etc. All counting must already have in view something to be counted. And that is what outweighs the mere counting of it. Thus, our first methodological constraint is to postpone the discussion of the numbers of stages in order to submit ourselves to the letter of the text. These are I'm now talking about method. We'll move on to the first, second, and third stage. But as I said, we must start by reading the text. We must give priority to the text. And this is how it opens. After these things, then I said, I make an image of our nature in its education and want of education. This is Bloom's translation, slightly modified. And in general, I follow Bloom just for convenience. But I will supply the Greek anyway. The words after these things refer back to the end of book 6, as we know, the discussion of the divide line, and the then indicates a new thrust in the conversation. But finally, the I said show that the speaker, Socrates, as we know, is reporting a conversation he had with others. The text is a reported dialogue, not a treatise exposing an author's doctrine, nor an uninterrupted myth, nor a lengthy speech, nor even a dialogue as such. The text then introduces us into a dramatic environment populated with specific characters in specific situations, with specific interests and intentions. So if we are to follow our methodological constraint and stick to the text, we see we must take the dialogue form in earnest. But if so, we must engage with the characters. And what this means is that in this instance, Socrates is talking to Glaucon, and Socrates asks Glaucon in this first sentence to make an image. So if we're following Socrates' lead, and he asks Glaucon to make an image, then to see that image and to consider it in order to formulate opinions about what is happening there, Glaucon is asked to imagine a scene in order then to surrender to the force of imagination, to believe his own fantasy, so to speak, like a child, to momentarily identify some character in that imagined situation, thus to collapse the distance from his own eikasia. In short, Glaucon is asked to identify himself with a prisoner, so the philological constraint thus entails a phenomenological constraint, and that is to assume the prisoner's perspective, to withhold the third-person perspective in favor of our first-person perspective. And this means that we let go of a kind of teleological reading of the story as a reader who knows how the story unfolds and so on and so forth. So we have to get back to the inchoate, open-ended, question-like aspect of the story, its manifestation, perhaps, to use Salus's word. The text lends itself to this approach, for it reads, make an image of our nature in its education and want of education. And Salus underlines this as well, and so I would like to do the same thing. This is not simply a story of education, but it also should be a kind of description or a representation of our lack of education as much as education. So that means that don't rush into the end of the story, and take your time to understand ignorance, corruption, want of education, whatever it is that we start from. And I find that Plato readings often neglect this side of Plato as an analyst of corruption, of motion, of decay, and of ignorance, because we are so wrapped up with the promise of knowledge or something like that. So the text, if we follow the text, we see that we must follow the point of view of the prisoner, and her situation is a situation of apaidiousia and not paideia, obviously. So let us follow her in her lack of education. The philological restriction led us to the phenomenological restriction, which in turn converges with the recognition of one's own ignorance, the recognition that perhaps we know the story all too well. So let us turn to the first stage of the story. Obviously, I will not read the whole text. I will focus on three texts, basically, and I'll pull out three observations that are based on the text and on the phenomenological method of reading it. So in the first opening scene of the story, what do we have? Very roughly speaking, the prisoner, we have a bunch of prisoners in the cave. I will speak of one prisoner specifically because the story will turn out to be about her. So that prisoner simply looks at shadows cast on the cave wall since her childhood with her legs and neck completely fixed. She almost seems disembodied, paralyzed, except her passive reception of visual stimuli. This is the cave is often compared with cinematographic representations of people just watching things, which is correct in a way. Hers is a life that is theoretical in its etymological sense of spectatorship. She's a spectator. Since she sees neither her own body nor that of other prisoners, she seems to lead an isolated life, a disinterested, solipsistic, deaf-mute life in which there is no measure of all things other than herself. Like a brain in a vat, she is an almost vegetative state, and she doesn't have even a distinction between true or false. Seen from outside, in this initial stage of the cave story, the prisoner starts out as a disembodied, disengaged, disinterested, disconnected, solipsistic passive subject in an epistemological vacuum and a persistent vegetative state. So I'm going to pull out one piece of text to shake things up, so to speak. There is something missing from this account, as Salus himself points out, something that gets mentioned later on in the text. So at 5:16 and D, we are told the following, and I'm going to dwell on this passage quite a bit. It's a little bit long, but bear with me. All of you would obviously recognize it, but I'll just look pretty closely into it. So, and if in that time there were among them any honors, praises, and prizes for the man who is sharpest at making out the things that go by, and most remembers which of them are accustomed to pass before, which after, and which at the same time as others, and who is thereby most able to divine what is going to come, in your opinion, would the returning prisoner be desirous of them and envy those who are honored and hold power among these men? The sentence is not just a pejorative remark about the values in the cave, since Socrates, let me see whether there are any people waiting to be admitted. Sorry about that. Yep. It's not just a pejorative remark about the values and the ignorance in the cave, because Socrates and Glaucon already talked about that, just the sentence before. This is rather an interrogative sentence that extends on 10 lines in the Stephanos edition and clearly specifies what prizes are accorded by the prisoners to one another and why. I like to emphasize the among them here, the parallelon, the fact that these honors are given by the prisoners to the prisoners with no external intervention. This aspect of the first stage defines the everyday life and basic assumptions of the prisoner no less than passive and solitary spectatorship of meaningless shapes, since the rest of the text not only refers again to these competitions for forming judgments about shadows, it underlies what the competitions are about for the prisoners. So in 517d, we are told to imagine the returning prisoner, and I quote, the returning prisoner is compelled in courts or elsewhere to contest about the shadows of the just and the representations of which they are the shadows. You can see that it's the same setup. There are original things, there are copies of it, puppets, I will call them puppets, and then there are copies of copies, that is the shadows of the puppets. And to dispute about the way these things are understood by men who have never seen justice itself. So this is, again, good reason for taking the contests very seriously, because what is talked about, that what is at stake in these is justice. A later passage even suggests that these competitions are not about the theoretical question as to what justice is, but directly about ruling and power. So in 520 C and D, Socrates says that the many cities nowadays are governed by men who fight over shadows with one another and form factions for the sake of ruling as though it were some great good. The daily life of the prisoners is occupied not by a kind of entertainment, as in cinema or TV spectatorship, but by an ongoing game of guessing the next shadow on the basis of an accurate identification of the present appearance and a good memory of the past. That's why I underline here thereby, ek touton. We'll return to that. These mentions of competitions make a cursory reference to Socrates' trial and death. That's unmistakable, obviously. And they also show that the cave is an utterly political environment where the prisoners debate exactly the same thing the characters in the Republic are, that is justice and also power. I think this changes everything. Suddenly, I think the first stage must be totally transformed. Let us look closer at the three kinds of games mentioned in the text. I will shortly look at the three kinds of games that are outlined in this long sentence in order to understand the mentality of the everyday life in the cave. So on the one hand, the first kinds of games are the guessing games, the games for predicting the future. The guessing games consist in betting what the next appearance will be and in waiting and seeing until it shows up. Then the prisoner clearly has a common language with other prisoners and even with non-prisoners, as we shall see. Her mindset is one of curiosity, anticipation, and novelty. Since there are competition and alliances, it must be the case that the prisoner takes herself to be a pragmatic competitor wanting social power, doxa, recognition and approval from a society of potential allies and shifting competitors. These members also somehow bestow these honors and give these powers to one another on their own. Again, I like to emphasize the fact that there is the puppets are manipulated, but the prisoners are not given any directives. They're not given any rewards. They are giving themselves the rewards and the honors and so on and so forth. The text makes absolutely no reference to any kind of external arbitrage, punishment, or reward. Given that her relationships are necessarily strategic, she must always be on her guard. There are no families, no households in the cave, obviously. Therefore, everybody's equal in the sense that everybody is just an equal competitor in a game. Truth for her is a correct match between her guess and an appearance, a belief that happens to be true, doxa alethes. Let me briefly outline the unwarranted assumptions of the statistical mentality underlying the guessing games. Take the following sequence. Here's a sequence of letters that I like to show when I go through the story. Now, for guessing the next shadow at the end of the series, you see it starts with 3 dots and it ends with a question mark. So right now, the the prisoners would be seeing the letter T, or the puppet represented by the letter T, and they would be asked to guess what comes next. For guessing the next shadow to make sense, the following assumptions must be made, none of which are necessary. That the pool of possible events be limited like a finite alphabet. And there is no need for that. There's nothing that warrants that the pool of events is finite. And also that the series of past events is limited, like the sentence that has a beginning, and nothing warrants for this either, in the sense that perhaps the series didn't start with the letter V here. This is just the prisoner's memory. That's why I put 3 dots at the beginning. So we don't know where this series started, and if this series went on forever, in the direction of the past, then that just changes everything. The third assumption is that the future will look like the past, and this also is unwarranted, and it leads to many impossibilities. Finally, the assumption must be that the nows be discrete. So here you have discrete letters, and this approach in a way assumes that our experiences or the events, the shadows, are discrete events. But again, nothing warrants for this either. A W can be thought of as 2 U's or 2 V's and an I with a dot. What makes it one letter? That is questionable. There's nothing in the shadow itself that warrants for its unit character. There's a discussion of this. This might sound very far-fetched, but there's a discussion of this in the Theaetetus about the letter theta, about the unity of the letter theta and how that unity is questionable. So the rational guess with respect to this series might be to say that we have a T now, a letter T now, and that T showed up 6 times before, and that it was followed by B once, it was followed by G twice, and A 3 times, concluding that it is relatively safe to say that the next appearance will be A. But maybe we now have not a T as such, but a T in the context of a preceding S. So what we have is a T that follows an S. And if this is our sample, then the result is not that A is the safest bet, but rather G is the safest bet, because ST is followed by G twice and by A only once. Finally, if we take the event to be in T preceded by an S, that was itself preceded by an S. So if we enlarge the sample that we take to be what is happening right now, the calculus changes. The algorithm gives us a different outcome. Consequently, left to its own devices, statistical mentality in these guessing games is arbitrary, since none of these assumptions seem warranted. And this brings us, in a way, to the identification games, because they try to guess the next shadow. But there's also another kind of game whereby they try to they debate what shadow they are presently seeing to begin with. And this makes things even more interesting and more problematic. Since the text mentions no authority for arbitration or record, the prisoners trying to identify a present appearance cannot but recognize that the truth of the matter cannot be settled by simply appealing to the appearing of a new shadow. So in the guessing games, we saw that it felt like the debates were settled by an objective, independent shadow showing up. But with the identification games, we don't have that anymore. We're all looking at the same shadow, and somehow we're trying to identify it. If there is to be truth about a present appearance, it must be established by means of the prisoner's debate. So if I'm seeing a shadow and John is seeing a shadow and we are disagreeing about it, and there is no external record or external referee, then all we can do is talk, sort of. The prisoners, the prisoners then must be well aware that nothing can settle a controversy about an appearance in the present except their own discourse. This is why, unlike the guessing games, they cannot reduce causality to contiguity in these identification contests, but recognize the import of their own interpretations, conflicts, and resolutions. To them, the truth of things present is to be attained through a communal environment of dialogue, discussion, deliberation, compromise, alliance, strategizing, propaganda, manipulating, consensus, and decision-making. This is why, from the beginning of the story, the prisoner can take herself to be neither the measure of all things, nor a purely passive spectator of shadows, nor a distant speculator about the next appearance. The prisoner is, and she must be at least aware that she is, a participant in the ongoing construction of truth. The prisoner experiences herself as engaged in a practical social political life. Finally, I'll stop the share. This might be a little bit alienated, and I don't see if there are any people coming in or any questions. I'll talk about the remembering games very shortly, and that will be the end of my account of the first stage of the story. Then I'll point to two other texts with respect to the second and the third part of the story. Then I'll conclude. The third kind of games that we are told these prisoners are busy themselves with in the cave since their childhood, basically, and they are very engaged in this. The third kind is the remembering games. The remembering contest makes things even more interesting because we don't even have a present shadow to refer to in order to settle our disagreements. In order to correctly remember the sequence of shadows, the prisoner must adequately have seen them in the first place, but the past may influence her perception of the present if the past sequences constitute a custom. And this is obviously a very philosophically charged word. It is reminiscent of Hume, but also of Ghazali before Hume and the Islamic theologians. And interestingly enough, the text warrants this emphasis because, maybe I should once again point to here you can see that Socrates already said that the rewards are given to the prisoner who most remembers which of the shadows are accustomed to pass before, and there the verb is eiothe, which is just the word for habit and for habituation, for custom. Socrates does take pains to say that the remembering games are about the shadows which are accustomed to pass in certain sequences. So to give an interesting illustration of this, we can say that if an Athenian is accustomed to see Socrates in light of Aristophanes' clouds from 423 or so, this would affect his judgment in 399 as to whether Socrates is an impious citizen corrupting the youth or something. See what I mean? But the real problem with remembering, it consists in indeed the fact that they pull the carpet under the debate among the prisoners, since the prisoners have neither any upcoming shadow nor any present shadow to base their claims to truth about the past. Since the text mentions no referees or records, we must assume that the prisoners determine the winner of the remembering competition among themselves. The absence of a common external reference point does not simply make the contests purely arbitrary. Note that the games, they play the games. It cannot be the case that they must be engaged in the games somehow, which means that even without this external referee, they must be able to settle issues to the satisfaction of roughly the whole community. Since the prisoners keep on playing without no external incentive, or compulsion, then this arbitrariness must put squarely on the shoulders of the prisoners alone the burden of keeping the games meaningful and even to a certain extent fair. The loss in objectivity of evidence for truth must be compensated by intersubjective responsibility for constructing truth. So at the end of this first stage, we see that the prisoner is quite active, and she takes herself to be active. Her body is not exactly paralyzed or disabled, even though she is bound in such a way as to prevent her body from self-relation and self-reflexivity, and this is going to be important for us. She's not able to touch herself or see herself in any way, and she cannot see or touch other prisoners. Even though she's bound in such a way as to prevent her body from self-relation, to give her the impression of an unmediated, transparent access to reality, we have also seen that she experiences her body as quite functional. Her eyeballs move, and most importantly, her tongue is loose. It is her tongue and her voice that gives her a physiognomy recognizable by herself and by others. I am way behind. Apparently, it's already 9:38. We'll see. I'll solve that problem in a second. Her voice not only lets her place her bet with regard to the next shadow, it is her vehicle for participating in publicly establishing both the present and the past shadows, which are at the basis of her guesses about the future. Thus, truth is not simply about correctness of guesses with shadows. For the prisoner, truth is amenable to negotiation, to vote, and to manipulation of whoever has a loud voice, repeats more, is more persuasive, and formulates his proposals at the best interest of the others. The focus of the games is less shadows than the other prisoners. This is a little bit of the upshot of my reading of the text. It feels like these people are more interested in their relationships with one another than with the objective truth about the shadows. Because causality here is not reducible to the relation between shadows or between the guesses and shadows, causality is found in the process of public decision-making. Thus, if there is a measure of all things, it's not the individual, but the society of competing prisoners as a whole. This society is not simply an aggregate of competitors, but a public, a constantly shifting majority. It is a strange image, I hope we might agree, and strange prisoners we are talking about here. This is the end of my first stage. As I totally ran out of time, I will give you in a nutshell the direction I go and the texts I refer to in the second and the third part of the story.
You can go a little longer if you want. Unless anyone objects to that. I find it really interesting too. You can do whatever you want. You can summarize them, or you can go through one of the sections maybe, or do whatever you.
Okay, so I'll summarize one section, then I'll dwell a little bit more on the third one. In the second scene, in the second stage of the story, we are told that one prisoner is freed from the shackles. She's forced to stand up suddenly, and she's forced to look at the puppets and the fire. And we are told that she is in pain, and we are told that she is asked questions about. So there is a kind of common language between the prisoners and the non-prisoners, and we don't know who the person is that is doing the freeing. The text is a little bit elusive. Let me share again the text here. It's a little bit long, but at first it feels like the freeing is passive. So the prisoner is freed somehow. The person is released and compelled and so on and so forth. But then at the end, towards the end of the paragraph, we are told that, what do you suppose he'd say if someone were to tell him that before he saw silly nothings, while now, because he is somewhat nearer to what is and more turned toward beings, he sees more correctly, and in particular, showing him each of the things that pass by, were to compel the man to answer his questions about what they are? Don't you suppose that he'd be at a loss and believe that he was, that what was seen before is truer than what is now shown? There are a lot of things that I want to underline. One is this person that somehow intervenes. I'll call it a stranger just for convenience. And I will underline the fact that she would say that the shadows are more true than the puppets. And now I'd like to underline the fact that she has very good reasons for holding this opinion, because the shadows were bigger, smoother, and clearer than the present puppets. The shadows were much more homogeneous, dark shapes, sharply contrasted against the bright cave wall compared to these multi-material, multicolored puppets. The puppets are told to be made of different materials, and perhaps they are even colorful. One of the puppets is, Socrates says, is a statue, and we will return to that. To add to these, obviously, the most compelling factor, the puppets are less familiar and more hurtful than the shadows. Ergo, the puppets are, at most, imperfect copies of the shadows. Now, the question that I ask at this stage is that how could the prisoner get things right? And we can talk about this if you want. My guess, the only solution that makes sense to me is, and I think the text really provokes this question. Socrates doesn't ask this to Glaucon, but I think it brings us right at the edge of this question. And my answer is that the prisoner, how could she get to understand that it's the shadows that follow the puppets and not the other way around? I think that, first of all, remark that no single look, no intuition, no detailed observation of the shadow and the puppet one by one separately would help her. Look all you want to the shadow. Look all you want to the puppet. Your eyes would get accustomed to the light. It will be less painful, yes, but by themselves and separately, they will not tell you that one is the original and the other is the copy. Neither the natural adaptation of her eyes to the light nor any more violent and subtle compulsion from the part of the stranger to parrot an answer would help her in any way, obviously. Then what would it take for the prisoner to get things right? My answer is that she has to act. She has to take the initiative of her situation, and she has to act with actually no reason, no prior intelligible reason for her to act. So it's almost a spontaneous act, and it's very unlikely. But in this unlikely event of her coming to understand her situation or understand the situation, she would have to take initiative and act, and most specifically, perhaps take up one of the puppets and move it in front of the fire, and then see that it is rather the shadows that follow the puppet and not the other way around. And we can, if you're interested in this, we can come back to this during the Q&A. Okay. And if she had done that, and if she realized that it was the puppets that followed, the shadows that followed the puppets, she would come to realize that in the past, during the guessing games and during the games in the cave, she had a notion of falsity. She had a notion of being wrong about things because she had bad guesses. She had wrong guesses. She is in touch with a concept of truth and falsity that is operative with her. But now she realizes that even when she was guessing correctly, in fact, her correct guesses were removing her even further from the truth that she is now coming to contact with. So she was wrong in a way that was just incomparable to any kind of getting things wrong during the guessing game. So now it feels like she recognizes another level of truth and falsity, so to speak. And she takes herself to be the agent that brought that level into consciousness or something like that. So more fundamentally, she would realize that truth is not just binary as a guess would, either conform or not conform a situation or a convention, but that truth is somehow gradual. And this comes up in the text pretty often. Heidegger talks a lot about this. The puppets are not truer than the shadows the way a correct guess beats an incorrect one. For the puppets contribute to the very existence of the shadows. The prisoner was wrong even when, especially when she guessed the right shadow, because the supposed truth of the guess occluded the untruth of her awareness of the situation as a whole. In other words, her relation to truth goes beyond being a guesser or a manufacturer of truth. She generates truth and untruth by the same token. One tiny little thing about this second stage, I think by moving and how she would do this medically, who knows, obviously. All her body's atrophied and so on and so forth. But just for the sake of the argument, if we hypothesize that she is able to move herself, she would be introduced to the third dimension that is depth, that is the third dimension of the puppet, as opposed to the two-dimensional shadows, but also her own mobility into depth. And here I'm drawing much from Merleau-Ponty in the sense that she would discover depth in another sense, perhaps in a more fundamental sense. She would discover herself as a three-dimensional being in a three-dimensional world. She can turn her neck without losing the integrity of her body. She can turn around in order to compare the puppet in front of her and the shadow behind. In other words, she would come to realize herself as bodily, not just occupying some space, but as striding into depth, so to speak. But indeed, one can zoom into the center of the world only at the cost of losing the same amount in the periphery. So the more you get into depth, the more you lose in the periphery. One can never move forward in such a way as to overcome the fact of having a back. So now she has a back. She's aware of having a back since she's doing this turning around anyway. And again, the comparison between the puppet and the shadow that led her to the realization has to be made by somehow changing her perspective and holding them together, collapsing them, superposing them, and then drawing an inference. So, a tiny little last thing about this, the second second stage. My guess is that the prisoner looking at the puppets and looking at maybe the puppet handlers around her might wonder why the statue looks like the puppet handlers. The statue is a statue of a human being, and the puppet handlers sort of look like, she might think that they look like one another. And she is suspicious with regard to resemblance, because she already discovered that resemblance wasn't just coincidental. There was a kind of strong, interesting causal relationship between the puppet and the shadow. So now she might wonder, well, maybe there is a similar optical relationship between a thing and its reflection, between the statue and the puppet handlers. That question she will be able to answer. She will be able to account for the resemblance between the statue and the puppet handlers later in the third stage of the story. But there's a second question that you might ask. The first question is actually about the eidos, the eidei in art and production. She will come to recognize, in the third part, she will have to recognize that the resemblance is not a coincidence, but you cannot account for it in optical terms. You have to produce something in order to see that the relationship between your model and your product depends on your production, and your withholding the eidos in front of you while producing a resemblance. The second kind of question that she might be able to ask without being able to answer is the question of the resemblance between the puppet handlers. So they look like one another. She doesn't have a self-image yet, probably, other than having a voice. But she will, in the third stage, she will come into. She will have to realize eidos in nature, natural, the eidae natural beings. So I'll move on to the third stage. We talked about the shadows, the puppets, and now we're talking about the things themselves. The prisoner is dragged out of the cave by the stranger, as we called him. But from this point forward, the mysterious somebody, the stranger, and the compulsion disappear from the text entirely. And I think this is very interesting. Outside of the cave, there is no compulsion. There will be compulsion later on when the person is forced back to go into the cave. But outside the cave, the stranger disappears. And the prisoner is left to her own devices. She's left to her own self-motion in order to keep on answering the questions that she has in mind. So, left drift outside the cave, the prisoner moves herself and takes refuge in shadows because they are easiest to look at, and then looks at reflections of things in water. And once her eyes adapt to the daylight, she looks at the things themselves. So with respect to production, I already said that she can come to understand the relationship between the statue and the puppet handlers by producing, I don't know, a statue or a puppet, by looking at some kind of original. And you can see that the relationship between the puppet and the shadow is different from the relation that we have right now between the thing itself and the puppet. And finally, I will turn to the text and just point to two passages and end my presentation. Well, I'll talk about the sun, obviously. This is the first thing that I'd like to point out. Socrates says, then finally, I suppose, she would be able to make out the sun, not its appearances in water or some alien seat, but the sun by itself in its own hora, and see what it's like. It might be a little bit surprising to talk about the seat of the sun, or the sun being in an alien seat and now seeing the sun in its own hora, because I mean the sun is not it doesn't, in a geocentric model, in a geocentric system, the sun revolves around the earth. So this hora cannot be a location. It looks more like an orbit. And in order to understand the orbit of the sun, you cannot just look at the sun and understand its orbit. You have to follow it during its daily motion. But there is more. And I'm sorry, the sun being in some alien seat, I think this is somewhat, there's a kind of a phenomenological tone here, in the sense that the sun makes things apparent, but in order to see things, we must disregard the light in order to pick out the things. If we look at the light on things, we're not really looking at things. We're looking at the light, or we're being distracted by the light. So here, for the first time, it's the sun itself that the prisoner is confronted. And the next thing that Socrates says about the sun is the following. And after that, she would already be in a position to conclude about the sun that this is the provider of seasons and years, and is the steward of all things in the visible place, and is in a certain way the cause of all those things she and her fellow companions had been seeing. Now, this passage doesn't say that the prisoner sees or looks at anything. Socrates' remark is made not in terms of gaze and vision, but in terms of conclusion. But what does she conclude then? That the sun is the provider not of light, but of seasons and years. We already saw a reason for believing the third stage of the cave story must take some time for the prisoner to get a hold of the eidos in art and production. Here we see that the prisoner needs more than hours and weeks to observe the sun and conclude that it is the provider of seasons and years. So this third stage goes on for months and years, probably. Socrates must have the yearly motion of the sun in mind here and not the daily one. So usually, as far as I can tell, the cave story interpretations take the sun to take its daily motion into account. But I think the text, not only here, but in two other passages, gives us strong, compelling reasons to think that what is happening here is that the sun is not just illuminating something instantly and making us see that. That is one side, one function of it. But this is not enough. If you're thinking in terms of the daily motion of the sun, you will not be able to interpret and make sense of the sentence here, that it is the provider of seasons and years. And actually, in 509b, during the sun analogy, Socrates openly says the following. He says, I suppose you'll say the sun not only provides what is seen with the power of being seen, but also with generation, growth, and nourishment, although it itself isn't generation. The conclusion is not an instantaneous enlightenment, illumination, or epiphany, but an act of understanding. What does it mean to understand that the sun is the source or provider of seasons and years? It means that the prisoner comes to grasp the sun as a source of heat, as the source of heat, or rather as the regulator, as the steward, epitropeion of heat, the provider of heat of life itself. Being and truth here are not subjected to the correctness of the gaze, as Heidegger is wont to claim, but rather they extend into the realm of birth, of nutrition, of growth, of migration, reproduction, and death. From the point of view of the prisoner, she comes to realize that in the highly technological setting of the cave, she was not deprived of light, but of the alternation of day and light. Not of the passage of time as such, but of seasons. That's what she lacked. That's one of the things that she lacked in the cave. The cave doesn't have any seasons, it doesn't have any years, and so on. It is through the seasons and years that she comes to acquire an appreciation of her specific way of moving and changing, of revealing and indeed of concealing truth. So she also understands herself during these years. She understands the natural A-Day, and she understands herself as part of a species. The A-Day in art and production were instrumental for the prisoner's agency and production. Now the natural A-Day, regulated by the sun, are final. Whether it constitutes a fourth stage or not, the story ends with a return to the cave, where the prisoner's vision is dimmed by darkness on coming suddenly from the sun, where she provokes laughter and anger among the fellow cave dwellers. And if they were somehow able to get their hands on and kill the person who attempts to release and lead them up, won't they kill her? Asks Socrates. No doubt about it, replies Glaucon in 517a. This gloomy end of the story suggests that the prisoner finds herself in the situation of the stranger. The stranger was not simply a private autonomous person, but a paradigm of education, a paradigm of human wisdom, as Socrates interprets his own wisdom in the Apology. Instead of releasing all her companions at once, she might now hope to turn the soul of one of them, just like the stranger did with her. So we all know this story, but once we lose sight of the text and disengage ourselves from the point of view of the prisoner, once we neglect the guessing games that occupies her everyday life as a whole, we mistake her starting point. And we end up basically with trying to build, absolute ignorance to absolute truth or knowledge. I will end by pointing to one last passage towards which I think all my points seem to converge. So I talked about the guessing games, how they worked and what the presuppositions were at work there. Then I talked about the act of the prisoner, how it's necessary, and in a way the phenomenology of that act. And then finally, I talked about the heating function of the sun. All these three, I think, converge onto Socrates' conclusion. At the end of the story, what Socrates says is the following. Then, if this is true, Socrates says, we must hold the following about these things. Education is not what the professions of certain men assert it to be. They presumably assert that they put into the soul knowledge that isn't in it, as though they were putting sight into blind eyes. One last tiny little quote from Jacob Klein's beautiful commentary on Plato's Meno. I quote, "The teacher is not primarily responsible for the pupil's learning. This responsibility is the pupil's own, but without the teacher's lead, the pupil would not have the opportunity to assume that responsibility." Thank you very much for listening. Take care, Gregory.
Great, thank you so much. There's so much interesting going on there. And I feel like you scratched open so many interesting things to work on. I'm not sure we're going to have time to even touch on a small amount of them, but we can get started now with anyone who has any questions. I guess just raising hands on the chat. Eric?
Yeah, hi, John, hi, everyone, hi, Omer. So I just want to ask for maybe some follow-up on the parallel between the time and agency involved in the prisoner making something in the cave, which I think you were saying is necessary for seeing the difference between the image and the original, or the puppet and the shadow, which is a reversal of how things initially look optically. There's that time, and then there's the time of seeing the sun in its hora, in the seasons and the year required outside of the cave. And there too, it's a matter of being able to see the original or the cause in relationship to what it affects. I just wanted to ask you to say, if you would, if it seems helpful to you, it might be helpful to me to hear you say a little bit more about how those two types of time differ, and those two types of relationship between cause and effect, or prior and posterior, or whatever, how they differ.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I feel I don't have a very good answer to give. I thought more about the temporality of the guessing games and so on and so forth, and that is obviously, it looks like it is reminiscent of the Humean contiguity and so on. But with respect to the quality of time, so to speak, it feels like the prisoner outside the cave, looking at the sun and inferring things, she seems to be doing nothing really other than observing and drawing conclusions. It's like she's taking notes, in a way like a scientist, sort of, and then saying that this is it looks like this is how things work. So there might be a way in which she's back to this theoretical stance, but she's no longer engaged in praxis. She is beyond praxis, and she's alone. Presumably, she went through the process pretty much alone. So in the cave, her agency was the first thing to recognize. She had to recognize her agency. She had to discover her powers of moving around, her bodily powers, her memory, and her ability to draw conclusions and so on. But outside the cave, it feels like she perhaps has to recognize the agency of other things. And in a way, other things that are sort of absolute, so to speak. So she was aware of the agency of other prisoners during the games. There was some kind of agency there, but they were constantly shifting and constantly redefining themselves one respect to the other. Whereas the sun doesn't look like that at all. The sun has, you must subject yourself to understand its regularity, so to speak. So yeah, this is a very rough answer or a rough approximation.
Eric, unless you have a follow-up, I have a question. Or okay, so I'm interested in this moment of being freed, and it struck me reading it this time and looking at the Greek and everything that he says if it happened by nature that they were freed, and then immediately after that it's ananke, that it's like a necessity, right? And so you get this duality between, I mean, similar to the statesman of the automatic versus the guided, or something similar to that, where nature is this kind of spontaneous movement, and force comes in secondarily and alters nature. Art would be a kind of force against nature or something like that. And then if I'm kind of trying to take your interpretation and look at that, and I was thinking about this kind of, duality that goes throughout the entire Republic, about between like knowing and learning, where something is complete versus something is in a process, and this gradual, like the instantaneous illumination of light versus the production of seasons and years and all of that. And so between these two alternatives, we have the turn, or that on which they turn, which is action, right? The action of the individual, which kind of combines the spontaneous and the guided. Does all that make sense and follow in the interpretation you're giving?
Do you intend, take care, Arif, do you intend to take these as two different questions, or are they, I don't see how they connect. I understand both of them, but if they are one question, I don't see the link between your first point and your second.
Between the kind of knowing and learning versus nature.
Yeah. Are they roughly the same? I can answer them separately.
I was seeing them as somewhat similar, or like a similar problem that you have this, but maybe I don't want to go too far with that. So if you have an answer that doesn't.
I mean, obviously the text doesn't seem to work well with the sharp distinction that we find, for instance, in Aristotle, between something that happens by nature and something that happens by compulsion and by force. Mm-hmm. Because oddly enough, we are talking about our own nature, and within our own nature, and as you pointed out, some things that happen by nature or naturally that are not smooth, they're not spontaneous, they are self-opposed. And I think that this self-opposition might be a candidate for coming to understand what's going on here. So it's odd. It's hard to be consistent about it. unless we think of nature in quite different terms. It doesn't feel like the word physis here means anything we mean by nature, either as essence or as trees and stuff. Both of these don't quite work. Or human nature is such that it has unnatural compulsion built in it somehow. It has conflict built in it, necessary conflict built in it. And I think that this idea sounds sort of right to me with respect to other dialogues. It feels like there's very, very often in the dialogues we come across these structures, the conflictual structures that are not just transitory things. They are built into the fabric of reality, so to speak. For instance, the corruption, the relation between power and justice, and so on. There are many things like this. So that's the issue about nature and compulsion. And so it must be the case that nature here includes a kind of compulsion.
Yeah, if you want me to connect that really quick, just why I was thinking those were similar, because learning in this example in the cave is something that requires a kind of, force and something painful even, and you have to adapt to it and all of this. And so I was putting that together with the ananke, like this necessity that is like an obstacle, but also the way to get to knowledge.
Yeah.
Versus this like freely given light that's already there and changed by acting and all of that. Yeah. So
let me think. I think the learning part that takes time and that is gradual and so on and so forth, in a way, does come to its own cycle when you understand the phenomenon. So there you, when you looking at the sun and understanding the seasons and how they relate to nature and reproduction and herself and so on and so forth, the answer is sort of or the phenomenon looks more like understanding than learning as such. And learning again, it doesn't feel. I wouldn't associate learning with compulsion in this story. As I said, compulsion or even the presence of a teacher, it seems to be necessary but not sufficient at all. That's why I made that last quote from Jacob Klein. So learning doesn't happen by compulsion. It needs some kind of compulsion, that's true, but the act of learning must be assumed and taken up by the student or the pupil, and there's almost nothing that warrants for that. And that's the interesting thing about it. The student, and this is where the possibility and the danger of abuse comes in, obviously, because the student has, or a child has no resource but to trust this teacher in order for them to pick up the reasons why that trust was well placed and so on and so forth. So this points to the possibility of the constant possibility and danger of abuse. But maybe I drifted a little bit from your question.
No. I think you got to what I was trying to say. Maybe I didn't articulate it properly, which is more or less that instead of this opposition, we have the act, which involves both something kind of like compulsion and a kind of spontaneity, where you act like the turn kind of just happens and there's no prior motivation, no reason to really know. It's by faith in the teacher or whatever the moment ends up being. And yeah, I think that's what I found really interesting in your presentation was this kind of identification of that act that is required to make the process go. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the point about self-opposition is important, and I sort of find it in the Republic every now and then. The fact that the human soul has parts, and these parts are not just parallel parts; they're just conflicting parts. So the human soul is very much, by nature, so to speak, it starts with a kind of conflict, self-opposition. So yeah, I'm relatively confident that this is not totally anti-Platonic. I think it's pretty. It sounds pretty Platonic.
Well, that's the whole beginning of the dialogue itself as well, with the compulsion to start the conversation.
yeah, exactly. Exactly, and also the pulling back into the cave is again the same kind of compulsion. It's not just external. It's part of our situation. It's not incidental to human nature. It is part of human nature to be compelled back.
And ultimately, the philosopher kings are forced to rule. So
yeah, and Glaucon says, well, wouldn't they be super unhappy because they would sincerely have their own interests beyond the city? And Socrates says that's not what we're interested in. We're not interested in making them happy. We are trying to set up a situation where the rulers are really not ultimately interested in ruling. That's the whole problem. And it looks like philosophers or philosophical people are able to have higher aspirations than anything practical, such that it is a good idea to let them rule or something like that.
Is there any more questions from anyone? Are you, this is published as an article as well, or it's in the works as a book, or what's?
I mean, I started working on this in 2003, and I've been repeating it way too much. I shouldn't be repeating the same thing this much. So this is probably the last time I'm giving this paper, but I will publish it as a mini little book, maybe in Turkish, maybe in English. We'll see. But I'm a little bit done with this story.
Well, if there's no further questions, I realize it's really late there, so maybe.
Yeah. Thank you very much, John. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Nilüfer. So, John, good luck.
Thank you.
Everybody, take care, guys. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Omer.
See you later. Bye.
Thanks, Omer.
Bye, guys. Bye.